So welcome to my video on doing an escalation list for Warriors of Chaos for Warhammer the Old World. This is the fourth video I'm doing on this topic for my fourth different faction, but of course if you haven't done this before, here's the basic rules I follow. So for leagues like this, you usually start out at building an army for around 500 points, and after 3 weeks or 4 weeks or a month or whatever your group decides, you bump that up to another point level until you eventually get to 2,000 points. Sometimes it's 250 point steps, sometimes it's 500, yours might even be different than that, but I will be building 4 different lists here at 500 points, 1,000 points, 1,500 points, and 2,000 points that you can use in an escalation league. I am following the basic rule here that once a unit is added to your army, it cannot be removed, only upgraded. So for example, if you add a unit of Chaos Warriors to this list, you cannot remove that block. You could add models to it, you could bring in fewer models, but you must have at least one Warriors of Chaos block for all future lists. The same holds true for heroes, but you can usually upgrade or downgrade them at will. For example, you could start out with the Chaos Lord on foot, and then at the 2,000 point level have him on dragon, and it still counts as the same unit and complies to the rules. Beyond that, escalation leagues usually have additional rules and everyone does them a little bit differently. For example, a common one is no magical weapons at 500 points or less. I'm not following any of those rules, there's just too many of them I'd have to account for, so be sure to know your league's rules so you can adjust this list to make sure you're legal for your games. And finally, I should point out that these lists are not made to be hyper competitive. They are not the most efficient lists you can put on the tabletop. What I'm trying to do here is build a balanced list that you can have fun at in a casual escalation league setting, and a list that shows off every aspect of the game to make sure we have some shooting if we have it, some cavalry, some artillery, etc. And one last thing, we're looking at the grand army composition here. The arcane journal lists will not be talked about, but maybe in a future video. And now that the boring blah 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 part is out of the way, let's talk about this 500 point list I put together. Unless you're going to run a Norska list, the Warriors of Chaos are probably the most elite army in all of the supported factions for the Old World. And by elite, I mean they're not going to have a lot of huge blocks of cheap units, they're going to have smaller blocks of more expensive units, but hopefully they all pack a punch. Case in point, this 500 point list only has about 20 models. If you want to get into the old world but don't like painty huge blocks or don't have a lot of money to spend, you really should look at the Warriors of Chaos. They are going to be the best faction you can put on the tabletop for low numbers. We are bringing a Chaos Lord here. We don't have any points left over, so we could really soup him up in any ways. He has no magic item, no special mark, but we really don't need it. He is fine at his base, and remember we're playing at 500 points. For the core units, we're bringing in a group of 10 Chaos Warriors. This unit has been nerfed from previous edition, and it is not the most efficient unit you could bring from the core units for Warriors of Chaos, but I'm going to make the assumption here that if you want to play the Warriors of Chaos in an escalation league, you want to field some Chaos Warriors, so we're definitely making sure we have them. Because we are a low count elite army, we need our combats to count, and we need to make sure we're getting into the combats we want to get into and that we're the ones making the charges and not taking them with our important units. So we have our Chaos Warhounds here to help screen. These can also run havoc on an enemy backline if for some reason you're playing somebody at 500 points who brings in an artillery piece or other ranged units that are giving you trouble. For our last unit, we're bringing in some chosen Chaos Knights. This is the smallest amount we can take, and they have not been buffed in any way, but at 500 points they don't need it. They're going to be our hammer, the rest of the army is going to be an anvil, and this is going to be very, very strong at 500 points. Even though our Chaos Warriors have taken a nerf from 8th edition, Warriors of Chaos are still going to be extremely strong at low point games and hard for any other army to handle, but this should balance out as the lists get bigger and bigger. Sourcing your army at 500 points is not going to be a big deal at all. I'm guessing most of you want to start or are going to start with the Warriors of Chaos bundle that GW just released. It'll have everything you need at 500 points except for your hero on foot. And if you're looking to save money, you could just use the hero that's mounted onto the chariots from the bundle. And just use him and then glue him onto the chariot later, or what might be wiser is put him on magnets and then you can move that hero from the chariot into a regular base. If you can't get your hands on the release that came out for the old world, you could also use the Age of Sigmar version of Chaos Warriors. They do look great. You might want to mix them into your army eventually anyways, but just keep in mind, because they're posed so dynamically and are so large, you might have issues ranking them up. And to save a little money or add variety to your army, you could always look at third-party sellers. Like all my videos, I recommend, if you're looking for third-party miniatures for your Warriors of Chaos, go to the 9th Age forums. For their Chaos sub-faction, they should have a thread that will have a list of every third-party manufacturer of Chaos miniatures that you can think of, and some discussion about them, whether they like them, whether they don't, how the scale fits. It should be a very helpful resource. And you might want to check out some of these options now, because at 1,000 points, we are going to move beyond what you can get from the starter box. At 1,000 points, our numbers are still quite small, but we are investing quite heavily into our heroes. Our Lord has been given a mount, and we're also giving him the Ruby Ring of Ruin so he can be a threat in the magic phase as well. I've also given him the Mark of Nurgle, which I feel like is the best overall mark, but if you want to use a different mark just to experiment or just for role-playing reasons, I highly encourage you to do that. We have brought on a Chaos Mage, and we're giving him a mount so he can get around the battlefield if we choose not to put him in a unit. I'm running Demonology here, but you might notice I did not have enough room to put a lore familiar on him, so his spells are random. I feel like most anything in Demonology will be helpful for this list, but if that randomness is something you can't stand, you could give him the Ruby Ring of Ruin instead, or you could find 30 points elsewhere to give him a lore familiar so you can choose his spells. I've added another unit of Chaos Warhounds just because they're going to be so useful to us to either chase down ranged units or screen for our more important units. I've also added 5 Forsaken here. Forsaken are pretty beastly in this edition, and they are probably undercosted for what they do. They are one of the better and more efficient units in this army, and I think if you end up playing this list competitively, you're going to run a lot of them. Feel free to experiment with associating them with different gods, but I really like making them Forsaken by Slaanesh. I like the extra charge range. It gets them into combat that much faster, which is where I want these Forsaken all the time. I've added one more to our knights just because I think running a unit of 4 is weird and unit of 5 just seems more natural to me. I've also given him a banner bearer and the war banner, which should make him even scarier than they were before. This is the unit I would run the Chaos Lord with all the time, and then depending on what spells your Sorcerer Lord has, I either run him here or have him freelance. Unfortunately, we are definitely beyond the starter box at this point. We need to get both of our heroes mounted on some kind of steed. Alongside the box set, GW is also releasing a few heroes, including a sorcerer and a lord on a demonic mount. But these are far from the only options you have. GW has created tons of mounted chaos heroes throughout the lifespan of Warhammer Fantasy and also Age of Sigmar. With a little bit of research, you can probably find one you like more than they're selling that you could probably find for a relatively decent price. If you decide you want to use one of the newer models made for Age of Sigmar, just be careful and make sure you can fit it on the proper size base. Or whatever it is worth, my personal picks for this would be the Chaos Lord that GW is selling and the out of production Herald of Decay model for a sorcerer. The big roadblock for putting this list together is going to be the Forsaken. Now, there will be a second wave of Chaos releases for Warhammer the Old World, and my assumption is the Forsaken model will be a part of it. But as of this recording, this is not confirmed, and the Forsaken models might not come back. So if you need them now, you're probably going to have to look at third-party retailers. Because Chaos lends itself to a lot of creativity, you're going to have a lot of really cool and unique options there. If you're feeling creative yourself, it's also pretty easy to kit bash some cool Forsaken. Just start with one of the Chaos Warrior bases, no matter which one you choose, add in some tentacles or other mutations, and you got yourself a stew going. If you need additional kit bashing fodder, there are mutation colts for 40k that might help a lot here. At 1500 points, we're not adding a lot. That's just one of the perks of building an elite army. Our Lord remains untouched from his previous iteration, but we are putting our mage on a chariot. I don't necessarily think this is the smartest thing to do, but I think it's flavorful, I think it's fun, and it'll let you use a chariot that you probably purchased anyways when you bought the Warriors of Chaos box set. But feel free to take that out and use the points elsewhere. We are also adding an aspiring champion to the list. This will make our list even more top heavy than it was before, but I feel like that's very fluffy when it comes to Warriors of Chaos. I think you need some powerful figureheads in front of your army. Because I can't afford to mount him on anything yet, I'm going to give him the Banner of Rage still, and I'm going to put him into our 20 Chaos Warriors, giving them Frenzy. That will give them a bonus attack and make them a lot more dangerous, but that means they can also be baited into charges you don't want them to make, so be very careful with positioning. I do acknowledge that I'm taking a big risk with this Banner of Rage, and I understand that a lot of people will not want to run that ever. But I think it's fun, I think it's a high risk, high reward move, and I think for an escalation league where it's kind of more of a casual setting, I think it's a perfect time to use something like this. I also think if you're new to the game, that using an item that gives you Frenzy and dealing with the downsides of Frenzy will really help you learn positioning and learn the game better. In our core units, I've added another unit of Forsaken. I just think not only are they good units, but they're a lot of fun to play on the tabletop. If you don't have the models or don't want to play with a duplicate unit, you could also replace these with Chaos Knights, but then you'll have to take out some points in your heroes as well to make it work. The other change we have for our 1500 points list is our big bad Dragon Ogre. This unit profile is really cool. There are a lot of really strong rules for a pretty minimal amount of points. This unit gets my vote for being the most efficient thing in the Warriors of Chaos book, which means I think you should get to know its profile very well. These Dragon Ogres are quite strong, and because my list is already top heavy and I do want to bring a Chaos Dragon but still keep this relatively friendly, I'm not going to bring more than one Dragon Ogre. They work best in groups of 2 or 3, I'm not going to deny that, but even one can wreak havoc on an opponent's flanks and is something your opponent will have to account for. As long as you can source 5 more Forsaken and you put in a pre-order for the Dragon Ogre box, this should be a pretty easy army to source from what you already have. But I do want to point out that there are a lot of different interpretations of what a Dragon Ogre looks like, and so it's at least worth checking out some of these third-party vendors to see what their interpretation is. You might like those a bit better. But overall, we don't have a lot of new units to paint at our 1500 points list, which should give you more time to perfect and paint at your 2000 point level. So 2000 points is what we've been building up to this whole time, and of course that means I'm going to bring a Chaos Dragon. There is no getting around the fact that this new edition is focused on monsters, cavalry, and heroes, and that makes Lords on Dragon very, very strong. But I also think for most people, putting a Lord on the Dragon is the pinnacle of what they want to do, and I think they're going to be very common in escalation lists. People want to put their greatest hero on a big monster. It's just a fun little power fantasy. But do fill out your group. If no one else is bringing their Duke on a Pegasus or their Chaos Lords on Dragon or whatever character on a dragon, you probably shouldn't either. The Old World, or any Warhammer Fantasy edition for that matter, works best when everyone is on the same page and everyone is going into the game knowing what to expect and what to expect from their opponent. It's a game where you should have a conversation with people so everyone's having the most amount of fun possible. The rules are just not built in a way where everyone can just go in blind and still have a very good time. But for the purposes of this video, we are just going to assume that everyone is building up to a strong lord on some kind of monster, and so we're going to make ours a absolute terror. Our Sorcerer Lord remains unchanged, which is probably the biggest flaw in this list. He is not a level 4 mage, and he can be bullied into being silenced. But we did give our aspiring champion a glow up, putting him on a steed and giving him a biting blade. Put this man within your chosen Chaos Knights and watch them do work. Putting our Lord on a dragon was very expensive, and unfortunately, adding a Hell Cannon is very expensive as well, so this will be our last new unit. Again, is this the most efficient unit you could take right here? Absolutely not, but it's fluffy to have a Hell Cannon, and this will be your first taste of artillery. And it will allow you to not only learn how artillery functions, but will help teach you how to play against them. So just one more quick comment on the cannon. A Hellfire cannon does have a chance to misfire twice when you fire it, and if it misfires in a drastic way, it could hurt units next to it, so maybe try to keep your cannon a little bit isolated from the rest of your units. But on the bright side, your Hellfire cannon has a massive amount of wounds. If it gets stuck in hand-to-hand combat, it's actually pretty decent, and if your shot hits, it can cause panic, which is actually very cool. So I think overall you're going to have a lot of fun with this list. It's strong, but it's not without its own risks. We don't have a standard ranged unit here, we just have artillery, so we're not learning that aspect of the game, but I just had a hard time working some skirmishers in. But even so, this list will teach you a lot about how Chaos works. It should teach you how to utilize your heroes, and you should learn a lot about positioning and dealing with Frenzy. Your Lord on Chaos Dragon should be able to handle most anything thrown at him, including your opponent's version of a hero mounted on a dragon. But if one of your opponents is going even harder into the hero, you might want to put a magic weapon on him to make sure he comes out ahead. We aren't adding a lot of new units here, but the units we are adding are expensive. As of the time of this recording, the Hell Cannon is available for pre-order from the Warhammer website, and it is a much fairer price than trying to find a used one off of eBay. But this is a unit that I expect to stay out of stock almost constantly, so I would try to grab one while you can if you do really want the official model. Otherwise, there are a few good third parties out there. As far as a Chaos Lord on Dragon, there is not going to be a release of an official kit, and I don't think there ever was unless you count the old Von Horseman model. This is something that you will have to kit bash, but you have a lot of really good options out there. I would start by finding a dragon that is easy to mount that you like, and then adding a Chaos Knight and some bits. If you want to stick with just the official models, my personal vote for best dragon would be to use the dragon from the Dreadlord kit from GW, which is still being sold by them. But again, there are a lot of options if you're willing to go third party from a 3D printer. Because the Warriors of Chaos are such an elite army, you might not find yourself to the point where you need a unit filler. But if you ever do and don't want to do it entirely on your own creativity, there are a few good options out there. I would recommend going onto Etsy and basically find Chaos Scouter terrain, and then you can use those pieces to make unit fillers for your own units, which should help you quite a bit. I would also look into some of the demons available from GW. I know demons are being kind of downplayed at this point in history for this Warriors of Chaos list, but I think they can make some great unit fillers, especially if your army is more themed towards one god over the others. Like if you're doing a Nurgle themed army, I think Nurglings make an amazing unit filler, for example. So that's my idea for an escalation list for Warriors of Chaos, but I do acknowledge that in a competitive environment, this list probably would not do very well. But if I was building towards a competitive hardcore list, this is the list I'd start with and do tweaking from here. I am no expert when it comes to the Warriors of Chaos, and so I went about building this the same way I start building any competitive list. I try to minimize the units that are inefficient and maximize units that are efficient. We are still really top heavy in this list, but that is pretty normal for the old world, at least in the meta up until now. But what that does mean is you cannot afford to make a lot of mistakes with your big expensive heroes. In our core, we are just going to ignore the Warriors of Chaos altogether. Infantry is not going to get us very far. We are instead going to run with Chaos Knights, which are a much more viable unit in this rule set. We're also adding skirmishers here because they are really efficient point-wise in this edition. And for 80 points, they can dish out quite a few wounds, and they can screen if you need them to fill that role. And in our special and rare slots, we are buffing up more Dragon Ogres because they are insanely good for the points cost, so I wanted to fit as much of them as we could. And for the last unit, I'm bringing in some Chaos Spawn. This might be probably something I would change out after some experimentation. I might try to fit a Chariot in here somewhere, but I do feel like the Khorne Chaos Spawn can really do a lot of damage and would really be a problem your opponent would have to focus on due to Killing Blow that might let your other units get off free. So again, I don't consider myself an expert when it comes to the Warriors of Chaos, and I haven't played around with the army list all that much. So this is a lot of theory crafting, but I do think it's a great place to start. If you have some advice on how to make this list better, or some units that I didn't use in this list that you swear by, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'm sure other viewers would be helped out by that as well. Otherwise, this is where I'm going to leave it. I really enjoy making these videos and reading the comments. It seems people enjoy these as well, so I'm probably going to do more in the future. So if you enjoy this, be on the lookout for them. Otherwise, if you made it this far, thanks for watching.